Well, I have the wonderful pleasure. I would love to start off with the bio, but I have to say I'll start off a little personal. I had the wonderful opportunity to meet Chris Stedman in living out here. When I found out that he lived out here, I was like, how many wonders are in Minnesota? And he is definitely a wonder to have met. It is really great to find someone who shares in a kindred likeness and spirit and mindset, and not only that, but a heart set to do a work regarding the people who are engaged in non-theistic, humanist, agnostic, or whatever you consider yourself to be free-thinking and free-forming. I want to invite you today to witness a gentleman and a person who is beloved by many. If you have ever read any of his books regarding IRL, Faitheist, and soon to be coming up, Nothing in Particular. Chris Stedman is a writer, an activist, and a professor who teaches in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Augsburg University in Minneapolis. If you have not, he is also known for his podcast called Unread. And it has been highlighted by The Guardian and Vulture and HuffPost and many others. He is also currently serving on the board of PFund, which is a LGBTQIA midwestern organization that provides direct financial assistance to those in the community. It is a pleasure to work with him. It is a pleasure to hear his brilliance. And so I present to you today, Chris Stedman.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me into this space. I'm so grateful to be here. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces, and I look forward to getting to meet those of you I've never met before. Before I get started, I just want to give you a heads up that I'm going to be talking about suicide loss in my remarks today, so just want to give you a warning about that. If you need to excuse yourself at any point, that is more than okay. So first, just a little about sort of who I am. Thank you again for the wonderful introduction. So I am a writer, I'm a professor, and I'm someone who's really interested in community. I grew up here in Minnesota in a non-religious household. I eventually became a Christian after I was invited to school, or to youth group by some friends from school. And that kind of set me on this journey with religion that I, in some ways, am still on. It's something I am very interested in, but eventually I sort of came to recognize that I myself am not religious. I don't consider myself a theist or religious. But I remain interested in what we as people who don't fit into a conventional, traditional, theistic religious box do when it comes to meeting our needs for community and meaning. So that really drives a lot of my interests as a writer, as a professor. After working as a humanist chaplain out east for the better part of a decade, I came back to Minnesota in 2017. I now teach in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at what has become one of the most racially, ethnically, and religiously diverse campuses in the country, despite being a school of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is the whitest Christian denomination in the United States. So it's a place of paradox, one where dominant stories are confronted by truer stories of lived reality, and that makes it a very interesting place to do work around religion, and also a place where I learn far more than I teach most days. I considered a number of topics for my remarks this evening, including doing a talk on the rise of the nuns, and more specifically the Nothing in Particulars, which make up most of the religious nuns or people who are not religious. That's the focus of my next book, and it is a group of people that folks tell a lot of stories about, some true and some very much not so. But I landed on a different topic because of the focus of this gathering. Mindful stories, a ritual of care. That phrase just really stayed with me after I received the invitation to come here, and I just kept turning it over. I think that thinking of storytelling as a kind of ritual invites us to not only tell stories with more intentionality and care, something that becomes absolutely essential when you realize just how powerful stories are, how they can either expand or reduce the horizons of possibility for those around us. But also, thinking of stories as a ritual invites us to receive stories with care as well, through the art of curiosity. Something that, speaking as a former chaplain, is critical to the work of community building. I'm grateful to be able to say that curiosity is one of those things that actually does come a little bit more naturally to me than some other things. There's a lot that doesn't, but curiosity, that's something that I'm slightly better at. In fact, a lot of the things that I do in life are driven by a curiosity about what other people believe, about why the world is the way it is, about how we should respond to the injustices we see all around us. It's why I believe in the power of community and the importance of interfaith dialogue. It's why I absolutely love teaching a class on storytelling and the search for meaning. I fundamentally believe that being curious about the lives and motivations of other people open us up to new possibilities in the struggle for justice. My curiosity is also a big part of why I am a deeply skeptical person. Now, I'm skeptical in the religious sense, obviously, but I'm also just skeptical in general. Whenever I go with friends to like a haunted house around Halloween, I'm always the person pushed to the front of the line because I just can't get scared by the whole thing. I just see, teenagers in cheap masks, and I just can't suspend my disbelief. So while everyone else behind me is screaming and hiding behind me, I'm the one at the front being like, hey. But this skepticism is something that, it can serve me well in my work. I think it's made me more critical of my own beliefs sometimes, as well as those of other people. I think it's encouraged me to keep asking questions in my writing. I think it's helped me become more critical of unjust structures and unjust stories. And I think it makes me curious about what's going on in the lives of the people I love. But my skepticism isn't always a curious one. Sometimes it is a self-protective thing, a way of not letting myself imagine something better, of not letting myself wonder about possibilities that I may not even be considering. My skepticism can be a way of not getting my hopes up too high, of sticking with the limiting, even the oppressive story that I already know, because its familiarity can feel safer than the unknown of undoing it and not knowing what comes next. My general reaction to good news is, can we be sure that it's good? Whatever the opposite of a silver lining is, there must be one, usually, is what I'll tell myself. But when I was 22, I met one of the most curious people I have ever known. Someone where I often have a skepticism that things might not work out or might not be as good as they seem. A cynicism that the world isn't going to change, that things aren't going to get better. He seemed to have, instead, this radical faith that maybe the most amazing, wonderful things were possible instead. His name was Alex, and meeting him changed my entire life. He showed me another way of being in the world, one that was unafraid to embrace possibility, curiosity, wonder, and hope. While I tried to stay on the safe, careful paths in life, he was constantly going off trail and trying to get me to go with him. While I was afraid to show people my full self, he was one of the most bravely genuine people I have ever met. He didn't care about life's rules. He wasn't afraid to be himself, to make a fool of himself even, to embrace absurdity instead of trying to eliminate it by questioning it into oblivion. Our friendship changed my life. And for a decade, he was one of the people I felt most connected to and most myself with. He helped me see that I could be less afraid of that kind of curiosity, less afraid to express myself fully, less afraid to break the rules. his story helped me rewrite my own. This is a common experience for a lot of queer people. We meet another queer person, someone who is less afraid of their queerness, and they show us kind of how to follow in their footsteps. And for me, that person was Alex. A few years ago, Alex died by suicide. I found out when I received an email that he had scheduled to be sent out shortly after his death. The email was a goodbye note. It was an expression of love. It also included this strange mystery, which was a couple of audio files that he attached to the message without any kind of context, that made it seem like he might have forged an online friendship with his favorite musician, Britney Spears, of all people. So it was these audio recordings of him talking to someone who sounded exactly like Britney Spears. Very strange thing. Now, normally I would have dismissed the idea that he might have actually been talking to Britney Spears, because how absurd is that? It's not possible. But in his honor, I found myself wanting to embrace his kind of curiosity, his radical faith that maybe the most, strange, amazing possibility could be true instead. So, with his family and friends, I worked to try to find out if I could discover who this person was. And I tell that story in the podcast that I made called Unread. So I'm not going to get into that story today, but I want to instead tell you a little bit about why I made it, why I decided that that was a story that I wanted to tell. In the weeks after Alex's death, I threw myself into helping his family plan a memorial service. Alex had said in one of his emails that he didn't want one, but also that we should do whatever we needed to do in order to make sense of what happened. So we knew he would understand why we wanted to have one. I also did what so many of us have to do in the United States, which is I set up a GoFundMe to raise money to cover the costs associated with his death because his family couldn't pay for them. When I shared that GoFundMe with my online network, I was almost immediately inundated with private messages from people thanking me for saying how he died. I just matter-of-factly said that one of the most important people to me, one of the most important people I've ever known, died by suicide. And immediately I heard from all these people just thanking me for naming his cause of death. There is such a culture of silence and shame around suicide loss. And that is a big part of why I decided eventually to tell this story, because I realized, like so many of the people I was hearing from, I needed stories of what it was like to experience suicide loss in order to help me make sense of what had happened. In fact, just a year after that, I lost another friend to suicide and learned from a very different sort of experience how challenging that culture of silence can be when his family didn't want anyone to talk about what had happened. Of course, I respected their wishes, but I found just how difficult that was for so many of the people who loved him to not be able to talk about his death or what happened. So I made Unread because I needed what the people who were reaching out to me needed too. Someone to name suicide loss and share a narrative of navigating it. As a young queer kid, I first looked to stories to help me make sense of my own experience and to help me see different possible futures for myself, to imagine myself doing what my queer elders had done. These stories, these queer narratives, helped me imagine this different future. They provided a blueprint that I could take and make my own. They were a lifeline and a tool of survival. And this is what stories can do for us. They can help us make a future possible for ourselves and help us make the world survivable. One of the people I interviewed while making that podcast was an employee from Trans Lifeline named Ivy Stacklow. I originally reached out to Trans Lifeline because I wanted to include insights in the show about how to support a loved one struggling with suicidality. And I specifically wanted to talk to an organization that had a policy of no non-consensual intervention. Essentially, they won't call the police on you if you don't give them permission to do so, which a lot of crisis lines don't. They do call the police, whether you want them to or not. So that was part of why I reached out to them. But I was also trying to understand how those of us who love people who struggle with suicidality should support them, and I wanted some perspective, and I got quite a bit. Ivy said something that stayed with me and continues to stay with me today. They said that suicide is often viewed as someone having this totally irrational moment, and if they can just be stopped through intervention from doing what they're trying to do, then we can get them back to a rational place. But Ivy said that actually it's not irrational to not want to be alive in a world that makes you feel like it doesn't matter whether you live or not die, a world that may be hostile to your very existence, that actually that is not at all irrational response, and that a world that is at best indifferent and at worst hostile to our very existence is one that we can't be expected to not want to be in sometimes. A world where we can't see a story for ourselves or a future. Hearing this perspective helped me understand that if we want to save the lives of LGBTQIA people, we need to make the world more survivable for LGBTQIA people, and that begins with stories that expand our sense of what is possible. When I was a queer adolescent, my life was saved by the elders who shared stories that made my world survivable. And today I believe in paying that forward, which is why I'm deeply involved in LGBTQIA mutual aid networks. Because while stories matter, they cannot be utilized if you don't have the material means to survive as well. But stories that transform our sense of what is possible are just as essential as food, water, shelter. We need them to survive. In the words of Indigenous author and scholar Thomas King, the truth about stories is that is ultimately all we are. So if you want a different ethic, you need to tell a different story. The stories of heteronormativity, of white supremacy, of Christian nationalism, these stories make our world feel smaller and less survivable for so many. These are the stories that need our skepticism. But sometimes we need someone who can help point the way to stories that also teach us how to live. Someone who can shatter the toxic stories and offer us different, better ones. And for me, Alex was one such person. I am sure that many of you here are that person for others, and I hope this weekend is helping you think deeply about how you can continue doing so even more courageously, to dig deeper into the work of dismantling what philosopher Hilda Lindemann calls the master narratives of culture, those that oppress and limit us, and to offer up what she calls a counter story instead, another story about how we might live and be. I think our humanist communities have much to offer when it comes to building counter-narratives, but also much to learn. The work of dismantling is essential, but so is the work of telling a new story in its place. So before I wrap up, I want to tell one last story about Alex, or rather about something that happened shortly after he died. Not long after Alex's death, I was doing a campus visit, something I've done many times before, but a student asked me what I, as an atheist, think happens after we die. Now, this wasn't an unusual question. I've literally gotten it probably hundreds of times over the years on campuses all over the place, but this time the question hit me in a way that it didn't usually. In the past, I gave some version of an answer like, well, I don't know for sure. There's a lot we don't understand or know, but my working theory, my best guess based on the available information is that there's not, and I live my life as if there isn't. It's a true answer, but it's also a little matter of fact. This time I said something different. I said, well, there are two answers to that question. There's what I might wish was true, and there's what I actually think. I recently lost one of my closest friends, I explained, and I would be lying if I said I didn't have moments of wishing I could say that I thought we lived on in some way after our deaths. But what we might sometimes want to be true is not the same as what we actually think. And while I wish I could say that I thought I would see my friend again one day, while I wish I believed in that story, it is in fact my sense that my friend is just gone forever that makes this loss so painful to me. It is what makes me so angry, and a big part of what makes his death feel like such an injustice, such a failure of the systems that were supposed to help him. At the time, I had recently finished reading a book called This Life by Martin Hägglund. Maybe some of you have read it. In this book, Hägglund argues that to the person who doesn't believe in an afterlife, the most precious resource we have is time, because we only have so much of it. Because of this, Hägglund argues that our finitude poses a moral imperative. It should force us to recognize that all people deserve to be able to spend their time in ways that they consider meaningful. This, he argues, should challenge us to work toward addressing the inequities we see all around us, toward building a more just society for everyone, one where people can spend their lives doing things that feel meaningful to them, instead of merely doing what they need to do in order to survive. I thought about this idea a lot after Alex died. The world didn't see the things that Alex spent his time doing, the stories that guided his life, that nourished and fed him, which were mostly about feeding his curiosity and feeding everyone around him. The world didn't see those things as valuable, and this made his life more difficult. It made surviving this world more challenging for him than it is for many of us. I also think a lot about how Alex did not get enough time. The story of his death constantly motivates me to work toward a world where people like him can get more time. When I think about what I want to be true about the world as it is right now, I think about a world where Alex would still be alive. I think about a more just society that supports all people, not just those for whom life as it is comes more easily. Because the same things that made Alex one of the most incredible people I've ever met, the story that he lived by that ran counter to so many of the things that our society says matter, like status and consumption and competitiveness, those things also made life difficult for him. He was a wanderer. He moved a lot. He had a difficult time holding down a job, again, largely because the stories he lived by diverged from the ones our world values. My self-protective desire to live a safer story kept me on track, while his free-spiritedness in a world that punishes people who deviate from the standard stories made his life more difficult. It made it hard for him to access the care he needed, to find the support that would have helped him stay alive. When I feel angry about Alex's death, this is why. That the things that made him so wonderful are also the things that made his life harder to survive. I may not believe in the story of an afterlife, but I believe in the ways that we live on in others. And so Alex's curiosity, his enthusiasm, his willingness to follow his own compass, the story he modeled for me of what an unapologetically queer life could look like, these things were courageous. He had the courage to hope and wonder that I so often lack when it feels safer to worry. And so I will carry those qualities of his with me forever. And I'm committed to sharing his story in the hope that it might help transform the world in the same ways it transformed me. Skepticism is a good thing when it is rooted in curiosity or courage. I would say that the skepticism that allows me to separate what I might sometimes want to believe is true from what I actually do, to separate the stories I may want to believe from the stories that I think can actually help us live and survive and even flourish in the here and now, I think that is that kind of skepticism. But just as often, my skepticism can be one of fear, one that is actually just cynicism, a refusal to get my hopes up and wonder, to be open to stories that challenge the norm, to imagine the possibility of narratives other than the ones I've internalized, ones that keep me and those I love smaller, ones that make me play it safe rather than challenge the restrictions of this world, ones that hurt far too many people with their narrow understanding of what it means to live a meaningful and good life, to counter stories that oppress us with ones that liberate instead, to let stories that no longer serve us go and embrace the stories of our time and the needs of the world around us. While I miss Alex fiercely, I will forever be grateful for how much his story has given me, the courage and the curiosity it has instilled in me. Because of him, I now try to embrace stories of curiosity and possibility, stories that can help us remake the world and reject the stories of separation, status quo, and fear. For me, part of this embrace entails sharing with others how Alex lives on in me and those I love. in sharing his story, a story that otherwise wouldn't be told in a world that doesn't value those gifts. So thank you for giving me the chance to share a bit of that story with you tonight. I hope you will take something of it with you back to your communities, and I thank you again for inviting me into yours. Thank you so much.
Do you need this? Do you need this? Chris, thank you so much for that. I am actually, if I had known, I probably would have planned for this a bit better. I know we were supposed to do a talk, so I want to be fair to that, but I also want to acknowledge the fact that you brought into the room Alex. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Alex as an ancestor. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge his life and how it impacted you. And some of you are very familiar with the fact that I practice libations, often from the West African tradition. In this case, I will keep it simple, but I will pour this out not only for Alex, but all of those who are experiencing suicidality and those who have lost their life for that same reason. And at the very end of this pouring out, I will say Alex's name. Do you know his full name?
Yeah, Alex Small.
Alex Small?
Small, yeah.
Small. And what I will do is I will ask that you will join me in saying the words Ashe 3 times. That word means it's happening, right? It is a happening. Please join me in that. We say Alex Small. And all of those who we also do not know by name, but we honor them in memory, we honor them in their journey, and we hold them close and dear. Ashe, 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 Ashe. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, family. There is no way to do that in any other way. You're very welcome, sir. Such an honor. You said some things I know for myself, so I'm very grateful. I might have to switch because I'm fuzzy, right? Yeah, we'll see how long I can keep this going.
Pass this back and forth.
Let's do that. Let's do that because I don't want to. Yeah, you know what it is? It's the fuzziness, and then I know our online community might be struggling. So you offer this story, and then you talk about a sense of disruption to the system, and systems that have dehumanized, systems that, particularly with queer folk, make us illegible. We're not easily read. And queerness has never been easily read, right? But when it is overt, when it is publicly able to be observed in such a way, I've gathered from this talk that you're asking us to reimagine that system. What do you see the system, or what do you see people, or humanists particularly, able to do now in reimagining this system? What can we do in reimagining the system already? If you've got 3 things for us, I'd love that.
Yeah, well, we've talked a bit about this already, and I'm sure we could talk about it for hours. I know we have limited time, so I'll keep this short, but I don't think it's a surprise to anyone in this room that, we are in a kind of transitional moment in terms of humanism as a movement, in this particular context, specifically here in this building, but also more broadly in the United States, in ethical culture. We are in a transitional place where kind of the way that things have been done is dying, and we don't really know what is coming. in 2019, I found myself feeling just like existentially overwhelmed by the possibility, or not the possibility, the certainty of climate change. And I was trying to figure out how to feel about that. And so I read all these books. Again, when I don't know how to feel, I go searching for stories, right? And so I read all these books on climate change, and one of those books was this wonderful book called Rising by Elizabeth Rush. Maybe some of you have read it. If not, I highly recommend it. So she, in this book, sets out to try to understand what is going on with coastlines in the United States. So she writes about how at one point in the history of this country, coastal land was considered very undesirable. It was swampy, it was marshy, it was not a place that people wanted to live, and so who ended up living there? People who were marginalized. It was largely, people of color. It was largely folks who were, more sort of moving from place to place and couldn't put roots down. And, what happened is at some point people decided, actually, we want to live by the water. So we're going to make that land desirable. We're going to fill it in. We're going to block up the marshes. We're going to pave over it. And we're going to bend it to our human will. Well, of course, what happened is that had all kinds of consequences that folks weren't prepared for. It changed ecosystems. A lot of that land would flood when, sea levels would rise and storms would come through. So now people are trying to figure out, how do we restore this coastal land that we've gotten rid of? Because actually it turns out we need it. And so this book, ultimately, it is about coastal wetlands and efforts to restore them, but really it's a question about, or really it's this exploration of kind of how do we restore what we've lost while also preparing for a future that we can't anticipate? Because the people who are trying to restore these wetlands are doing so while also knowing that the seas are rising, and so that land's going to change again. And so really it's about uncertainty, and it's about knowing that kind of how we've done things is not working anymore, but also we don't really know how to do them better, and how do we sort of live into this future uncertainty. And so the reason I bring this up is because, I was a humanist chaplain. I built humanist communities, and a lot of what I'm wrestling with as I work on this new book about the nuns is this sense that, how we have done things as a movement, as a community of people, is not reaching a lot of younger nuns. It just that the way that we do things is not how they do things necessarily. And so we need to be willing to completely maybe let go of some of the stories that we've lived by, the stories that have given us a sense of meaning, and live into something that we don't know yet what it's going to look like. And that is scary. And I wish I had 3 concrete tips for how to do that, because, I think we all know that, what we're doing is going to change. It is changing already. But I guess the 3 tips would be to just embrace the messiness and uncertainty of it, because that's where the change is coming from. To not just embrace it, but actually lean into it. That's the good stuff. And again, be willing to part with stories that even have been personally meaningful to you, if they're not the stories that are needed now in this particular time and place. So that was 2, but I think that's probably enough. I'd love to hear what you think.
I think. Well, when we think about, I'm glad that you brought this up, because I believe a lot of times when we engage story, there are stories that have been bestowed on us, and there are stories that we have had to live by. And those are not the same as being bestowed. I like to make that distinction, because some of those stories that are bestowed are ones that we can, live without. But then there's those stories that we live by, which are by systems. And then there's the other story that we are, authoring ourselves. And most of us don't get a chance to do that most of the time, because in order for you to author your story, that is the moment where you recognize your liberation. And I'm always very concerned that humanism has done a very good job talking about liberation, but has never really achieved that within practice, because we get stuck in the story we live by. And so when we think about change, we can only think within the system. We can only think within a democratic politic. We can only think within certain institutional structures and bylaws. We can only live into the way that finances dictate our existence and being. And as a result, we then suffocate those who are trying to live in means that do not say that we matter. And so that's kind of where I situate myself when I think about, particularly maybe I will add to your tip, your two tips. My main encouragement to most folk is to take the opportunity to really engage the moment, to no longer be complacent with the lived by systems and stories. We do have to break away from them, and it will get messy because I do not live by the story. I actually talked to one of my, she's become now like a mother to me, but me and Jackie Sims, we go back and forth in trying to understand each other's story, because I'm a different breed of the liberation that she came out of. But I am the wildest dreams of my ancestors. And I can guarantee you, they would be like, boy, what you doing? You better behave yourself in front of these white folk. That's what they would say to me. And how do you do it? And I've had that critique even today just because of certain social respectability politics. And that is in some way restricting. And so what I think the other thing that I want to lead us into with another question is, I'm beginning to think of the author of ontological nihilism, Dr. Calvin, I believe his last name is Wright, and he begins to unpack, when a system makes you invisible, when our ability to see ourselves is no longer a reflection in the world, it is daring to exist every morning for some folk. It is daring not only because of systems, but because of maybe also social structures, families, and so on and so on. How would you suggest, now you talk about skepticism as kind of the defense mechanism. I am curious, as you were kind of excavating a bit of Alex's story, did you find liberation in the story?
Thank you for that. There's so much in what you said that was just incredibly rich. So I hope you were all paying very close attention. But no, I found myself going in so many different directions, while also just trying to listen and not have the mind immediately begin firing, which is so hard to do. But there was, at one point you said, you were talking about how we can't even sort of imagine something outside of the story that we know, inhabit, that we know. And it reminded me of this book I just finished yesterday called Hospicing Modernity. I wish I could remember the author's name, but I will look for it. But it's a wonderful book, and she argues essentially that modernity, the sort of conditions that we live in that shape our sense of what is even possible, is dying, and that rather than trying to save it, you would put it on life support, or that we should hospice it. By which she means that we need to let it die, but we need to let it die a dignified death, one that involves us learning from it and learning the lessons of it. And when I was trying to dig into Alex's story, I found myself so often limited by what I could imagine, because there were so many things about his life and the way he lived that were just beyond the bounds of how I have often limited myself, or the stories that I've lived by. And sometimes we can't even really kind of prepare ourselves for what we can't actually imagine. And, Alex, I do like what you said, I think was so true. Just him existing was a threat, a confrontation, an act of radical bravery, because again, the things that he thought were important just ran so, he did not think that things like status or competition that, that give so much of us a sense of our identity and self, he didn't think that there was value in any of that. I mean, he was always so loving and sweet, but like, he was never someone who was going to be like, oh, you were on Fox News. That's so interesting. He would be like, he would immediately take, if I'd been on like television, he would take a screenshot and turn it into like the stupidest meme, kind of making fun of me, in like the most loving way possible, basically saying like, you are not your status, you are not your achievements, you are, what I love about you goes beyond all of that. And I think when I was working as a humanist chaplain at Harvard and Yale, it felt so strange to be there for so many reasons. My mom didn't go to college. I went to a very small Lutheran college here in the Midwest, so I very much felt like a fish out of water. But the one thing that I felt that I could offer the students that I worked with in those environments was a space in their day, in their life, that was not about status or achievement or competition, that was just about coming and being in community with someone and experiencing love and care that, was not contingent on any of that stuff. And I think that's, for me, where a lot of this begins, is we need communities where people can just show up exactly as they are, where they don't need to defend their existence, they don't need to make the case for why they matter, where they just are met with love and, are seen as mattering just because they are. And that from there, that's where we begin to, I think, start to be able to imagine stories that are beyond our current imagining. So all that is to say, I would really, the book Hospicing Modernity, it's going to stay with me for a long time because, at its core, it's saying, how can we imagine something we can't imagine? Which, and I think we are, as a movement, as a species, we are headed into unknown future, and the more we can embrace that and try to operate just out of a place of loving people, I think, that's a good first step anyway.
You've got me, you're pushing on me because I'm one thing I do critique in our movement, particularly ethical culture, is I always ask, where is the love? Where is the love? And we root, if somebody asks me, what is ethical culture? I often go, oh, easy. It's about right relationship, ethical living, a service to democracy, and compassion with service. And that's quickly the lump sum for me. I don't need to lay it all out with anything fancy. But I never talk about love. Now, most people will argue and say, well, no, we talked about compassion. I get that. But love as not as a means of compassion, as in I see pity or I see someone who's in need. But I'm also hearing in your story in this moment too, the need to define love not as action, but love also as affection. And I'm wondering how have you been able to, definitely a prolific writer, but I'm curious how you're holding these two narratives of love in action and love as affection. Because I believe that there's something there. And I'm wondering if you don't mind just kind of building that out for us.
For some reason, I find my mind going to an event back in, I want to say, April of this year. I was invited out to speak at a university in Utah. It was a public university, but because it's in Utah, it is the public university that has the highest single religious percentage. 80-something% of their students are Mormon, even though, again, it's a public university. So very Mormon environment. After my talk, we had this very long Q&A where there were a number of responses like this, but one of them was a student who put her hand up and said, that she doesn't feel at home in she was a Mormon. She no longer feels at home in the Mormon church for a number of reasons, but she's also tried going to a bunch of other different communities. She's gone to a Unitarian Universalist congregation. There was a Oasis group, which is another kind of humanist community that she went to, and like none of these places really worked for her. And some of it was like intellectual, some of it was like about what she believed and how she saw the world. But I think, I don't want to speak for her, but I think some of it was also a feeling thing. She just didn't feel the love when she went to these places, whether it was a Mormon community or a UU congregation or whatever. And it just, it broke my heart. She was crying. She was talking about how she feels lost. She feels like she doesn't have a place where she can find community, and she really wants it. And I just found myself thinking so much about all the different times I've gone to different places, like as a part of writing this new book, as a thought experiment or whatever. I was like, I'm going to go to the Lutheran church 2 blocks from my apartment just to see how it feels. And I went, and everyone was perfectly nice. And the sermon was interesting. It sounded like something I would have heard in a class I took in grad school. It was interesting. But again, intellectually, again, it wasn't a fit. But also, I just have gone to a lot of these places and just not felt it. And I think, it's hard because when we're talking about love as a feeling, as affection, we're talking about something that is, kind of intangible. And we want to be able to just fix it and say like, well, how can we do it right? Like, what's the right answer? What are the bullet points we need or whatever, but it's either there or it's not. It's in the air. It's a feeling. And I think as humanists, or at least I can speak for myself, as a humanist, I'm often like, I really resist that. I want to say like, well, there needs to be like an answer. We need to be able to break it down to something really tangible and whatever. And, I think what's tough about that is that, it's just very clear when someone doesn't feel it. They come once and then you never see them again. It's like they didn't feel it. And we can try and fix it with a committee or a handbook or whatever. But or like I was talking with the pastor of that church near my place. They rewrote their welcome statement recently, and he was hoping that would make me feel welcome, because they say that it doesn't matter if you're Christian or not. Whatever you believe, you can come. And I was like, that's very thoughtful, but it's not about the welcome statement. It's about a feeling. And I think again, there's not like here are the quick steps to doing that, but I think it does begin with, again, being skeptical in a curious way about what stories we're living by and whether or not those stories are actually working. And I think a lot of the communities I've spent time in are so focused on love as a narrative or as a practice, that they don't question whether or not love is something that's actually being felt. I hope that's helpful.
No, I think that's very helpful. And I extend that, to us to think about as well, because when we do talk about love as practice or action, right, we do have to consider what affections are involved, because people deserve to feel. Audre Lorde would say it best that our founding fathers gave us, I think, therefore I am. But the Black mother, the poet in us whispers, I feel, therefore I am free. And so I have to illuminate that a bit with this talk, because Alex, I would also say, felt a sense of freedom by offering you truth. Maybe not something we could all immediately encompass within our own understanding of life and how we value life. But for one to name within their narrative, I declare this to be my freedom. It is, as well as it's challenging for us to name, very important for us, how we are going to break away from our stories, break away from these systems, and engage us in such a way that we go into a place where, a little bit further with Audre Lorde on this idea around knowledge as erotic, that there's a sense of intimacy that comes with us, that we know that we are in right relationship because I not only just see you, I not only just hear you, but I feel you. And I hope that we can engage that as a sensorial practice. We use that word in Montessori, sensorial practice, a way to get in touch with each other so that we can become more intimate in knowing, because that allows for us to have a shared knowledge, a shared vision, as some of you have mentioned today, so that we can get this movement to actually be the movement that puts love in action, but has a rooted dialogue around affections, and that we can be whole together in a broken system. I want to thank you